Go ye into all the world and preach the gospel to every creature. Repentance and forgiveness of sins should be preached in his name to all nations.
Nephilim Giants is further elaborated in another ancient manuscript, the Book of Enoch. Apparently, the Watchers, who were fallen angels, interbred with the women on earth, and as a result, the Nephilim Giants were born. We know that these ancient manuscripts describe the Great Deluge, a massive flood which, according to scientific data, really happened.
There were Nephilim on the earth in those days, and also after that, when the sons of God came unto the daughters of men, and bare children to them. The same were the mighty men of old, the men of renown. Genesis chapter 6, verse 4. Genesis chapter 6, verses 1 through 7 are some of the most enigmatic verses in the Old Testament. What do these verses refer to? Was there actually giants living on the earth at the time before the Great Flood? This period is often called the antediluvian period. Ante means before, and diluvian means deluge or flood. Many early Jewish writings and other ancient texts expound upon these verses. Josephus, the first-century Jewish historian, implies they are related to the Greek gods.
Josephus and the Book of Antiquities, many angels of God now consorted with women, and begot sons who were overbearing and disdainful of every virtue. Such confidence had they in their strength. In fact, the deeds tradition ascribed to them recalled the audacious exploits told by the Greeks of the giants. But Noah urged them to adopt a better frame of mind and change their ways. The Book of Antiquities, Chapter 3.
When people began to multiply, and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that they were fair, and they took wives for themselves of all that they chose. Genesis 6:1.
Do angels have sex? The text tells us that the angels, they're called the sons of God, mate with human women and produce a race of giants as their offspring. Now, the story seems to represent this as something that displeases God. God doesn't like the idea of this mixing between the angelic realm and the earthly realm.
And they bear children unto them. The same became mighty men. Those would be the Titans of old, the Olympians, the Greek and Roman giants of mythology, except the Jews never believed those were mythological creatures. Josephus said that the Titans were one and the same as these mighty men mentioned in Genesis.
Because we're taking the message right from the Word of God.
Right.
And Genesis 6 is just one passage that talks about the angels. The book of Jude, of course, talks about the fallen angels. It talks about angels who kept not their first estate, but were kept in chains for the last day. So there's a dark story here, and what you've just told us right out of Genesis 6 is that these angels left their first estate in heaven. They obviously had a free will, and they came to earth and procreated with human women who they lusted after, who they found attractive. If you go into the ancient book of Enoch, it says, and of course Enoch is not gospel and not the canon of Scripture, but in the book of Enoch, which a lot of old-time historians value greatly, it says clearly that these angels looked upon the women and their long hair, and they found that very attractive. And of course, you read the writings of Paul later in the Gospels, where he talks about women hiding their hair, putting their hair up.
Absolutely, and there is a spiritual component to all this, and that spiritual component has to do with the fall and with sin. There was a fall in heaven as well as a fall on earth, and that fall produced a race of giants called the fallen ones, the Nephilim. That's who we're talking about, which comes from the Hebrew verb nafal, which means to fall. In fact, nafal gives us our English word fall, just as a little side issue there. But the Bible says there were giants in the earth in those days and also after that.
The flood of the Bible and the flood of the Greek myth are remarkably similar. Is it possible a core of truth existed in the Greek myths? Were the Greek gods actually the Nephilim? Nephilim is the Hebrew expression for the fallen giants. Were the fathers of the Titans and the Olympians the fallen angels, called the sons of God in Genesis 6? The ancient Greeks believed in a flood that destroyed all mankind, similar to the account in the Bible. In the Greek myth, the flood took place during the age of Deucalion. Deucalion and his wife Pyrrha were warned in advance of a coming flood and told to construct a chest and fill it with provisions. The source of the coming flood was the anger of Zeus towards mankind. Zeus had become disgusted at the degeneration of humans, and in particular, the practice of human sacrifice. Zeus assembled the gods and decided to destroy mankind by water. Deucalion and Pyrrha survived the flood by floating in the chest they built. There are differences between the Greek myth and the account in the Bible. However, both maintain the world was destroyed as a result of mankind's sin, and the human race was saved as a result of a few individuals leading a righteous life. Every culture around the world has a flood story. Many of these stories refer to giants before the flood, just as the Greeks referred to their gods, the Titans and the Olympians. Many scholars are making the association of these Greek gods with the Nephilim and the fallen angels from the Genesis account. And just like the flood, many cultures around the world have legends of the star people, the ones who came down from heaven. I am convinced the star people are the fallen angels, the sons of God.
If you study classic Greek mythology, you run into the Titans. These creatures in the legends and the myths were partly terrestrial and partly celestial. They rebelled against their father Uranus, and after a prolonged contest were defeated by Zeus and condemned where? Into Tartarus. Do you see a parallel brewing here? I'm going to suggest to you that the legends of the ancient Greeks embody the truth of what really happened in the past, that there were these strange creatures generating hybrids that the Greek called Titans. And we see Zeus in many forms. We see Atlas and Hercules, Atlas and Hercules from Greek mythology were what would be called in the Hebrew Nephilim, offspring, intermarriage between a god and a woman. And so now these legends we obviously see in the Sumer culture, in Assyria, in Egypt. I'll show you a few things. In the Incas, the Mayan, the Epic of Gilgamesh, in the Persian mythology, and certainly in the Greek mythology, which most of us as products of Western civilization are familiar with. Also in India, Bolivia, South Sea Islands. Every one of these cultures, and the American Indians, every one of these cultures have legends of the star people. These people that came, these gods or demigods, whatever, came and cohabited with women and produced hybrids.
The latter days, in part, will be distinguishable because of the rise of powers that have been suppressed or repressed over the years, but in the latter days those powers will emerge once again. And one of our favorite verses has to do with some of the words of Jesus in Matthew 24, starting in verse 36, "But of that day and hour knoweth no man, no, not the angels of heaven, but my Father only. But as the days of Noah were, so shall also the coming of the Son of Man be." And what he's saying here is the days of Noah will be sort of transplanted into the latter day era. And you and I both believe we're seeing that right now.
Absolutely. One of the, in my opinion, we're looking at the return of the Nephilim. It's a different incursion than what happened thousands and thousands of years ago. I call it the coming great deception. And what we're going to see is, or what we are seeing, is this manifestation of orbs and craft and other phenomena, other anomalies. Meanwhile, shows like the History Channel's Ancient Aliens program is promulgating what I call the coming great deception. They're saying that E.T. created all life on this planet, that they genetically manipulated all life on this planet, that they started the world's civilizations and religions, and now are coming back at this critical juncture in human history. Well, Christians in the church better wake up to what is happening, because this phenomenon is real, burgeoning, and not going away.
The Book of Enoch is one of many ancient texts which depict the Nephilim and their deeds. In 1947, a wandering shepherd stumbled on some writings hidden away in several caves near the Dead Sea. This collection, lost for nearly 2,000 years, became known throughout the world as the Dead Sea Scrolls. Included in the scrolls is a hidden book lost for centuries which told about fallen angels, bloodthirsty giants, and a warning for all humanity. This book gives an alternative and fascinating description of creation and the demise of man. It is an ancient writing filled with dreams and visions, a tour of heaven and hell guided by the angel Uriel. The Book of Enoch is named for the man who the Holy Bible says walked with God.
And Enoch walked with God after he begot Methuselah 300 years, and begot sons and daughters, and all the days of Enoch were 365 years, and Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. Genesis chapter 5. The Book of Enoch begins with the warning to all humanity. A divine judgment has been rendered and sentence will be imposed. God tells Enoch that all life on earth will be destroyed in a violent flood, and with the story in Genesis, God blames this evil on the sons of God, angels who lusted after the daughters of men.
These angels are sometimes referred to as watchers. They keep constant watch, and they decide one day, about 200 of them, that they're going to descend to the earth. They would like to very much make contact with these mortal women.
The Book of Enoch was an expanded story of the mysterious giants, the sons of God, and the daughters of the earth, spoken of in Genesis chapter 6.
Anytime you read the book of Genesis, there are all kinds of unanswered questions. Suddenly, there is this quick few verses at the beginning of the flood story about giants in the land that come from the sons of God mixing with the daughters of the earth. And you stop and think, wait a minute, what's this all about? It's like it went by too fast. And you want to grab it and say, wait a minute, what was this?
They taught them charms and enchantments, and they became pregnant and bared great giants whose height was 3,000 ells. When men could no longer sustain them, the giants turned against them and devoured mankind. Enoch chapter 7.
That these angels have crossed over this boundary that they shouldn't have. They were spiritual beings and they were to remain as such. When they decided to descend upon earth, this unleashed upon the earth all sorts of problems. Not only these giants who are bloodthirsty and violent, but also these angels went on to teach humankind a variety of forbidden crafts. They also taught human beings how to make weapons of war.
Now the good angels, the ones not tempted by these beautiful women, go to God and say, you know, there's a lot of bloodshed caused by these bad angels. At which point God says we need to bind Azazel, the sort of lead fallen angel, to bind him and to then cast him into a pit. We might think of this as, how do we take care of nuclear waste in the 21st century? You take it out to a part of the world where no one lives, and you bury it as deep as you can. For this community, the angel was like that sort of nuclear waste. Dangerous, volatile.
After the rebel angels are cast into the depths of the earth, Enoch has a dream vision. The lead angel, Azazel, begged Enoch to plead their case before God, to petition them and release them from the depths of the earth. The request for clemency is denied.
And now, the giants, who are produced from the spirits and flesh, shall be called evil spirits upon the earth, and on the earth shall be their dwelling. Evil spirits have proceeded from their bodies, because they are born from men, and from the holy watchers, their beginning and primal origin. They shall be evil spirits on earth, and evil spirits shall they be called. As for the spirits of heaven, in heaven shall be their place, but as for the spirits of the earth, which were born upon the earth, on the earth shall be their dwelling. And the spirits of the giants afflict, oppress, destroy, attack, do battle, and work destruction on the earth, and cause trouble. They take no food, but still hunger and thirst, and cause offenses. And these spirits shall rise up against the children of men and against the women, because they have proceeded from them. The Book of Enoch, chapter 15, verses 8 through 12.
Enoch tells us an expatiated story of creation and the depravity of the Watchers, or fallen angels, who created bastard children of gigantic stature, with an intense evil nature. Their strength was prodigious and their appetites immense. Upon devouring all of humankind's resources, they started to consume humans themselves. The Nephilim attacked and oppressed humans and were the cause of massive destruction on earth. Enoch also wrote another book from the Dead Sea Scrolls called the Book of Giants. Only broken fragments remain from the original scroll. It tells more about the corrupt nature of the Nephilim and how they created all kinds of monsters, altering the DNA of animals and man. Enoch says their imagination was the only limit. It is my belief Enoch is explaining the dinosaurs and the bizarre skeletons which archaeologists have found. They were a part of the abomination which provoked God to terminate all living creatures. Modern science is constantly endeavoring to classify the remains within some Darwinian theory. It would take more faith to believe in them than it does to believe in the Bible. Many creationists, without understanding the antediluvian world, try to force some defensive explanation which fits their theories. Some scholars believe there were select dinosaurs created by God based upon a behemoth description in the book of Job, chapter 40, verses 14 through 24. They insist there is evidence of these creatures after the flood, but it's only conjecture. However, many of my own theories are conjecture as well. It makes sense that dinosaurs are related to birds when you accept the idea of the Nephilim crossbreeding the birds and animals. If you crossbreed a crocodile with a giraffe, or an elephant, you can imagine what it would look like. All modern scientists agree the dinosaurs were destroyed at the same time by some cataclysmic event. Couldn't this event be a global flood? Some scientists say the sea life found in the Himalayas and other major mountain ranges is due to the fact that they were once seabeds. Is it possible the sea fossils found were deposited by a global flood? God destroyed the world because everything was corrupt, except for a few righteous people. I find it interesting that the science of today is again altering the gene pool under the guise of improving humanity. Are we back to creating monsters? Is it a sign of the end of days? Jesus said the end of days would be like the days of Noah, and the altering of DNA certainly qualifies us with the time of Noah.
The Nephilim on the earth in those days. Other translations say the word giants, which is somewhat of a, I mean, they were big, but that they weren't called giants because they were big. They were called gegenes, or they were called Nephilim, because they were fallen ones, and they were the progeny of fallen angels and women. And what's so interesting is that every ancient commentary, whether it's Philo, Josephus, the Book of the Giants, the Genesis Apocryphon, if you look at the Aramaic Targumim, all of these are saying that very thing, that it was angels, fallen angels, that came down and took women, and they created this hybrid race. So Satan was trying to destroy the seed, but God, of course, preserved the seed so that when Mary came on the scene, then the Holy Spirit overshadowed her and placed the other half of the needed seed in there, so that it was through Mary's seed, through her gamete, her 23 chromosomes, and the combination of the Holy Spirit giving 23 chromosomes, which would then produce the zygote into which the Lord Jesus was incarnated into.
Man can now peer into a single-cell organism, transplant DNA, research deep space, and create computers capable of processing 1 million bits of data in just nanoseconds. All of our achievement in technology has done nothing to promote our morality. We can be a very corrupt and arrogant people. The Bible's narrative of sin has been the best explanation I have experienced. It brings to light the dark nature hiding in all of us. The good news is, the Bible provides a way to overcome. God's love for the world is expressed in the sacrifice of His only Son, and whoever believes in Him will not perish, but have eternal life.
And Jehovah God formed man of the dust of the ground, and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life. And man became a living soul. And Jehovah God planted a garden eastward, in Eden. And there He put the man whom He had formed. Genesis chapter 2 verses 7 and 8.
The Bible tells us the Garden of Eden was the intended habitat for man. Because of the original sin of Adam and Eve, they were cast out. This story is known throughout the world. The story is told in Genesis chapter 6 is only known by a few. Now they have to survive in a hostile environment. Little did they know how hostile it would become. The reign of the Nephilim started around the time of the patriarch Jared, the 6th generation from Adam. The very angels entrusted to help man now conspired against him. The angel Satan was always incensed and jealous of Adam, and refused to pay him homage. Now a group of conspiring angels mated with earthly women, and these women bore the Nephilim. God's creation became an abomination. As we have already heard, these giants were bloodthirsty and made themselves to be gods. The Book of Giants, written by Enoch, reveals part of the story and elaborates on the exploits of the giants, especially the 2 children of Shemi-Hazo, Hoya and Heya. Since no complete manuscript exists of the giants, the exact contents and order remain a matter of guesswork. Most of the content of the present fragments concerns the giants' ominous dreams and Enoch's efforts to interpret them, and to intercede with God on the giants' behalf. The Book of Giants, like the Book of Enoch, tells us how the Nephilim altered the DNA of animals and man, creating all sorts of monsters. The Greek myths of the Minotaur, Satyr, and Centaur take on new and more realistic perspective. The ancient cultures of our distant past were not simple-minded, as we have been led to believe. They were highly intelligent in mathematics, physics, engineering, and astronomy. Where did this information come from? The following clips are about a few ancient sites and their myths. According to ancient Chinese legend, Over 100 pyramids discovered in China are the legacy of extraterrestrial visitors. When local villagers were asked about the pyramids, they said the ancient giants constructed them. When they questioned a custodian of a local monastery, they were told, according to records housed in the monastery, the pyramids were said to be at least 5,000 years old. One can only guess at their real age. Did the antediluvian giants build these pyramids, or was it the post-flood giants? They said the pyramids belonged to the old emperors who reigned in China, and the emperors always stressed the fact that they were not from Earth. Rather, they were descendants of the sons of heaven, who roared down to this planet on their fiery dragons. It is interesting the custodian used the phrase, sons of heaven. This is the terminology of Genesis chapter 6 verse 4. These pyramids tell us about the presence of giants on earth, whose fathers were the sons of heaven. These pyramids were aligned astronomically, and this astronomy was common in other structures throughout the world. Teotihuacan, the city of the gods, is just south of Mexico City. The largest pyramids are the pyramids of the sun and moon. They were said to be built by an early race of giants from the first world. After the completion of the pyramids, these giants turn into gods. According to Aztec myth, all of the gods sacrificed themselves for mankind. This causes the government to be established and the birth of the Aztec civilization. Once again, we see pyramids built by giants who considered themselves to be gods. These gods instructed the people to sacrifice humans to please them. The early Jewish writings expound upon the Genesis verses and describe many more details about the cannibalistic Nephilim, and we can see their bloodthirsty traits carried out here. These pyramids, like those in China, were built by giants and had astronomical implications. As a matter of fact, this whole complex is a reflection of our solar system. Were the Nephilim trying to duplicate the Giza Plateau? In my books, The Middle of the Earth and the Messianic Temple, I present my evidence concerning the Giza Plateau in Egypt. I concluded the Giza Plateau is the middle of the earth as described in early Jewish writings. It was intended as a witness and sign for the one true God. To the ancient historian Josephus, I explained the Great Pyramid as one of the pillars of Seth, which was to be an astronomical record for all future generations, including us. The Nephilim were perverting all of God's creation and were attempting to replace God. We see that plan being carried out here at Teotihuacan. The city represents astronomical pyramids, temples with bloodthirsty sacrifices, and was built by giants. In Mayan mythology, a group of 4 protective deities, the sons of Itzamna and Ixchel, are giants who uphold the sky at its cardinal points. Just like Teotihuacan, these giants built the original pyramids as astronomical observatories. It is well known today the calendar of the Mayans is more accurate than our own. They understood the concepts of pi and zero. It is even thought they had a representation of a black hole, called the Dark Rift. Their understanding and knowledge reflected that of the Nephilim. The Nephilim were part angel and had a knowledge far superior than man's. These gods also instructed the people in bloody sacrifices. Even their games depict the dark path set for the Mayans. The image of a priest cutting the still-beating heart from a man probably delighted the Nephilim. We can only imagine their intoxicated and wicked laughter. The Book of Enoch and the Book of Giants tell how they devoured man in the worst way. They also created genetically altered beasts to help them in this quest. They were bound and determined to pervert all of creation. These temples tell us of their astronomical knowledge and their reprehensible past. The Maya were still communicating with the fallen angels, who were cast under the earth, and the Nephilim spirits in an alternate dimension. The Maya priests would alter their state of mind with hallucinatory drugs and spoke directly to the gods of the underworld. Even though the angels were already judged and doomed in the underworld, they were still communicating with those who would listen. Although the bodies of the Nephilim were destroyed, their spirits still preached to the Mayans and all other Mesoamericans. Many researchers believe the ruins of Tiwanaku, situated only 12 miles south of Lake Titicaca, is the oldest city ever discovered on Earth. Consistent with these theories, the Inca living in the region during the Spanish conquest explained that Tiwanaku had existed for thousands of years before their civilization began. According to Inca legend, Lake Titicaca was revered as the location where the god Viracocha created a race of giants, and later the first humans. The Inca maintained that the giants built Tiwanaku and also many other cities and structures in the area. However, due to their great evil, Viracocha destroyed the giants in a world flood. This legend is still believed by the local Indians to this day.
The facing stones of this site are perfectly set with no mortar. We took a needle, and that needle we tried to insert at every point along the joint, and the needle couldn't be inserted. A perfect fit. Now the ancients constructed the site with astronomical alignments in mind. As the sun rises each day, it moves along the horizon and arises in a different spot. To measure this movement, they built the temple itself as a giant clock to tell them how the progression of the sun was proceeding. And we can use those same astronomical alignments to date the site. The antiquity and the technological sophistication of Tiwanaku should make each and every one of us fully question the origins of civilization.
Did you know Sudan has more pyramids than Egypt? These are obviously man-made pyramids and temples which included human sacrifices in the attempt to carry on the Nephilim tradition. The knowledge of giants and their sacrifices were translated beyond the Great Flood. The local stories of giants in Sudan are similar to the early Jewish writings and Genesis, such as this legend. There was war among the giants, and they were very evil. They killed many people for their resources, and many great warriors died at their hand. One day the Lord decided the giants were the cause of the world being unbalanced and full of hurt and pain. The Lord called the chief of the giants and told them it was time for all giants to leave the world. Archaeologists have unearthed an ancient tomb in northern Sudan, which they believe confirms the location of Africa's oldest human sacrifice. Also found were relics indicating a knowledge of astronomy and astrology. Here again we see astronomical pyramids and human sacrifice, passing on the tradition of the giant Nephilim. Are these megaliths and legends telling the same story? They all point to an ancient civilization more than 12,000 years ago. They tell of giants, human sacrifice, and astronomy. I am convinced there is a thread of truth running through these places and legends and is woven into the Genesis chapter 6 narrative, early Jewish writings, and many ancient texts. These structures and legends are spread over the entire earth. They are duplicates of the Giza Plateau, the original pyramid of Seth, intended to be a sign and witness of the one true God. The Nephilim knew of the coming flood and wanted to pass their legacy just like the pyramid of Seth. All of these legends tell of a great flood destroying man, except for a few who survived in a boat and repopulated the world. There are many more legends of giants around the world, such as the island of Malta, the giants of India in the Mahabharata, the giants of good and evil described on the walls of Angkor Wat, the story of the Sumerian Gilgamesh, the American Indian legends of giants, the Norwegian tales of giants, and many more which I could not include. For a comprehensive list of the ancient texts describing the Nephilim and the Watchers, visit my website, www.thenephilim.us. The atmospheric conditions before the flood were much different than they are today. The pre-flood conditions allowed for gigantic growth. We know that God put many restrictions on Earth after the flood. What we now call the laws of physics were not as conforming. The Bible tells us He restricted man even more after the Tower of Babel episode. The giants and dinosaurs could not exist in our atmospheric conditions as they did in the antediluvian age. I believe God altered the atmosphere for the purpose of these future restrictions.
Optimal genetic expression means the best that the organism has within the DNA is expressed because of favorable atmospheric conditions. Under these described conditions, plants and animals would live longer, be much larger, and that's precisely what we find in the geologic column in the fossil record. Plants were much larger, all living systems were larger. We have animals that today have an 8 or 9 foot stature with a 16 to 20 foot stature. We have insects such as the dragonfly. Today, the dragonfly has perhaps a 4-inch wingspan. In the fossil record, his counterpart, Meganeuropsis, had up to a 5-foot wingspan. Everything was larger in the past.
I'm of the opinion that under better atmospheric conditions, people were living not only longer, but they were taller, much taller.
Giants and dinosaurs could not exist today as they did in the past because the atmospheric conditions simply will not permit it.
We had a greater ozone layer at the time prior to the flood. At the time of the flood, it was diminished to about 1/7 of what it was at that time, and therefore, life on this earth as we know it no longer has the same life expectancy as it did at the time of the flood.
Being interested in Earth's original conditions, after 35 years of research on those parameters, I've attempted to reconstruct that context. And in so doing, I've had our engineers build a biosphere that doubles the atmospheric pressure, that increases the electromagnetic energy, that increases the ratio of oxygen, but not to the level of toxicity, that eliminates ultraviolet radiation, etc. And the experiments that we've run have been very gratifying. In our controlled scientific experiment, we have measured the effects of a pulsed electromagnetic field on biological systems. We have these pacu piranha fish that normally at 3.5 years of age are about this size under optimal conditions. Yet we have them now in excess of 20 inches, weighing just under 5 pounds each. Under these controlled conditions, we have succeeded in producing giantism at an accelerated rate.
Genesis tells us that even after the flood there were giants in those days. Somehow some giants, at least one, maybe more, survived the flood and again populated the earth in small numbers. Chapter 10 of the Book of Jubilees suggested 10% of the giants were permitted to reign on earth after the flood. With the altered atmospheric conditions, their growth was restricted. In Numbers chapter 13, verse 33, we are told that the Anakites were the descendants of the Nephilim. In the book of Joshua, chapter 10, verse 4, we are told that Og was also the remnant of the giants.
Mass graves of giants were opened. Some of the men 8 feet tall, some of the women 7 feet tall, some records of men 10 feet tall, and extremely large skulls. And extraordinarily, some of these skulls had horns, some had extra rows of teeth, some had other what we would call anomalies, but they were extraordinarily large skulls and extraordinarily large people.
A number of mounds in the Midwest in America were excavated starting in around 1850. And in many cases, they would find skeletons of people who were in excess of 7 feet tall. And in many cases, they had double rows of teeth, as well as, in some cases, 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot.
The one that was found in Bridal Veil Falls, California by a group of miners, first they found this wall with very intricate hieroglyphics. They assumed that they were finding gold behind the wall. They broke it down, and they found this woman holding a child covered with fur and a strange kind of dust. The same tall female mummified remains have been found in Texas. They have been found in Death Valley. They have been found in other parts of California.
Archaeology at that time was in a heyday. There was everybody that had a shovel was out trying to find something. But what's interesting is that the finding of these giant mummified bodies and giant fossils and bones, really you can't pin to any particular location. They were finding them in Greece, they were finding them in Italy, they were finding them in the Middle East, they were finding them in America. And even if you write off a few of those as perhaps a hoax or a misinterpretation of something else, you're still left with a tremendous amount of evidence to show that there were these giant beings at some point walking the earth.
They began excavating the 10 to 15 feet of guano that was here in this cave. They started discovering some unusual artifacts. They found duck decoys, baskets, other things for hunting and fishing in the nearby lake that's now drying up. But then they made some very unusual discoveries, and those were of red-haired giants that were mummified. These giants were 6.5 to 7 feet tall. In many cases, they were mummified, wrapped up like Egyptian mummies, and they had long red hair going down to their shoulders. The ranchers couldn't explain it. It was the strangest thing they'd ever seen. But the Paiute Indians who lived around here knew all about it. In fact, back in 1883, Sarah Winnemucca, a Paiute Indian princess, had written a book called Life Among the Paiutes. In that book, she talked all about the giant, red-haired people who used to live around this lake and live in this cave. She claimed they were cannibals.
That tribe would eat the dead. They would make war on my people. My people went to work and gathered wood to fill up the mouth of the cave. At last my people set it on fire and called out to them, "Give up or you will die." But no answer came.
I think the world looked like the cities we see in Machu Picchu, Tiahuanaco, Sacsayhuaman. I think it was a world peopled by giants who structured their buildings out of massive building blocks, 500-ton, 250-ton blocks.
The architects are that race or those races who built all the megaliths in the old world, the pyramids, Stonehenge. They are the people who walked before us, the ones who inhabited this world before we did. We have called them gods. We have sometimes called them giants. They left their handiwork behind, and we have not been able to duplicate it. We've only reached the point now where we can really appreciate it.
In Lebanon, 44 miles from Beirut, are the imposing ruins of Baalbek. There is mention of this place in the Old Testament, the Book of Kings.
Baalbek in particular is a very good example. That has the trilithon. Those are the largest stones in the world ever used for construction. They're so large we don't even know their actual weight. Those stones were somehow quarried, moved 5 miles, lifted 25-30 feet in the air, and placed together so closely that you can't fit a razor blade or a piece of paper in between them. We have no idea how they did it. We don't have a crane in the world that can lift weights anywhere near what those things are.
According to Arab tradition, the earliest temples here were created after the flood by a tribe of giants for the biblical king Nimrod.
It seems quite clear because of the references in Genesis and later on the book of Numbers and also in Deuteronomy, which are all fairly consistent with each other, that there were gigantic beings that seem to stem from pre-flood era. The conclusion in the tradition seems to be fairly clear that gigantic beings were existing at one time, and that as human history developed, or physiological, emotional, spiritual changes took place, those beings who survived seemed to be of a smaller gene pool. But the possibility that there were other strands of humanity, as it were, seems to be almost explicitly stated in the Bible itself.
In the book of Numbers, we are told, after wandering in the desert with his people, Moses sent out scouts for a place they could settle. The scouts went north to Hebron. On their return, they reported, "All the people we saw there are men of gigantic size. We felt no bigger than grasshoppers, and that is how we looked to them."
If we look at Scripture, there were giants in the earth in those days. And if we take that literally rather than symbolically, that there were simply men of great powers and extraordinary abilities, then we could say that the first men, the first humans, were giants, or we could theorize that these giants came from somewhere else and used Earth as a colony.
This colony was the conception of the Nephilim. It was their fathers, the fallen angels, who came down from heaven and introduced earthly women to a new strand of DNA, creating all sorts of monstrous beings. There were giants in those days, and also after that. In my research of ancient civilizations, I was surprised to find these bizarre elongated skulls in Egypt, throughout Africa, Europe, Russia, South America, on remote islands, and indeed all around the world. Who were these people, and what were these freakish skulls? I soon found out it's a practice called cranial deformation. It was an intentional practice which had its roots in ancient times. It was done for important people such as royalty and priests in order to mimic a fallen race of giants.
Another aspect that we have to consider is that skull and cranial deformation, forming elongated heads, is a practice that's known throughout much of the ancient world.
The pharaoh Akhenaten's family is a good example of this practice. His son, Tutankhamun, is probably the most famous example. But why was his deformed skull kept a secret and not taught in public schools along with his known history? The Discovery Channel recreated his head and intentionally modified it to look more modern. Not one word was spoken about his elongated skull. They also resurrected his stepmother, Nefertiti, and again nothing was said about the cranial deformation. King Tut's sister is probably the most pronounced deformation I've seen in Egypt. The Discovery Channel chose to filter out this information simply by ignoring it. It seems our public school systems have the same mindset. It's like the elephant in the living room. How can you possibly ignore something so bizarre?
As I said, over the past 150 years, these archaeologists and anthropologists have covered up as much evidence as they've dug up, literally.
Basically what you find is something we call a knowledge filter. This is a fundamental feature of science. It's also a fundamental feature of human nature. People tend to filter out things that don't fit, that don't make sense in terms of their paradigm or their way of thinking. So in science you find that evidence that doesn't fit the accepted paradigm tends to be eliminated. It's not taught, it's not discussed, and people who are educated in scientific teachings generally don't even learn about it. It's not necessarily a deliberate conspiracy in the sense of some people getting together in a smoke-filled room and saying, we're going to deceive people.
I discovered this practice was actually an effort to carry on the traits of their gods. But who were their gods? They were a race whose fathers were fallen angels and their mothers were earthly women, as explained in Genesis chapter 6 and many ancient texts. The Bible refers to them as the Nephilim, the fallen ones. The Mayans credited Kukulkan for their knowledge of astronomy. He was a giant all-knowing god and bore no resemblance to the dark-skinned Mayans.
The Maya described Kukulkan as a tall Caucasian man with long flowing silky white hair and beard and blazing deep blue eyes. He was said to have an elongated skull, and in fact, the Mayan women used to strap boards onto their infants' developing skulls to elongate the skull, and we have artifacts of this nature. The question was, who was Kukulkan?
Kukulkan was from the race of the Nephilim, just like the Titans and the Olympians of the Greek myths. Cultures all around the world have legends of the star people, the ones who came down from heaven and created a race of giants. In Sumeria, they were called Anunnaki. We know them as fallen angels, called the sons of God in Genesis chapter 6.
When people began to multiply, and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that they were fair, and they took wives for themselves of all that they chose. Genesis 6:1.
Do angels have sex? The text tells us that the angels, they're called the sons of God, mate with human women and produce a race of giants as their offspring. Now, the story seems to represent this as something that displeases God. God doesn't like the idea of this mixing between the angelic realm and the earthly realm.
These genetically altered beings had elongated skulls and desired that mankind worship them as gods. Their elongated skulls were created by their bastard genetics. It allowed for the brain to grow to enormous size. This is where the practice of cranial deformation started. People began to mimic this trait in order to carry on the tradition of the giants. They are the very reason God, the Creator, destroyed all life on earth. They were an abomination in His sight, and they corrupted all mankind except for a few righteous people, the family of Noah.
They took infants' skulls and compressed them and bound them, and they forced the cranium out and elongated, and in many cases they doubled the size.
People have suggested aliens had elongated skulls, and apparently ancient peoples are mimicking those skulls. The old saying is that imitation is the sincerest form of flattery.
These ancient alien theorists attribute cranial deformation to aliens from outer space. They believe people saw them as gods and mimicked them. Part of this is true, but they were not aliens from outer space. They are from hyperspace, where they were sentenced by God. Now living in a parallel dimension, they are spirits and now called demons. God destroyed their bodies right before the Great Flood and sentenced their spirits to abide in this dimension.
What's really strange is that this is found all over the world. And this is something that archaeologists cannot easily explain. Because for people on remote islands, for people in South America or Malta or in Africa, to suddenly independently do this cranial deformation like this seems incredible. I mean, this is something that had to be learned, something that was taught to them.
We seem to have basic similarities, as if there was one civilization or at least one type of culture that was influencing people around the world. I find it more and more difficult to believe what I was taught as an undergraduate, that all these different cultures just coincidentally came up with the same concepts independently of each other.
These ancient alien theorists are right. This is a learned behavior. The practice of cranial deformation dates back to the antediluvian age. The Nephilim Giants created this practice all around the world. We know a few of the giants, at least one, escaped the flood and was allowed to live with mankind, but was severely restricted now. When God separated men during the Tower of Babel episode, this learned behavior followed man throughout the world. It was especially prominent in the Americas, where the Nephilim were still worshipped as gods. The Paracas History Museum in Peru has one of the largest collections of elongated skulls. The Incas created some of the most deformed ones. These skulls are testimony to our ancient past and the bizarre story of the Nephilim. Something most people can't accept because it defies what they have been taught. God destroyed the Nephilim's bodies because of the corruption and rebellion. He also brought judgment on their fathers, the fallen angels. These skulls should serve as a reminder of a disobedient race and their eternal judgment. Christ is returning for those who love Him.
In 1848, President Abraham Lincoln visited the Niagara Falls, and he was so impressed by the beauty of this natural wonder that he wrote down some notes, including the following. When Columbus first sought this continent, when Christ suffered on the cross, when Moses led Israel through the Red Sea, nay, even when Adam first came from the hand of his Maker, then as now, Niagara was roaring here. The eyes of that species of extinct giants, whose bones fill the mounds of America, have gazed on Niagara as ours do now. During the 19th century, there were many accounts of unnaturally large skeletal remains discovered in the ancient burial mounds scattered across North America. Today, not a single news media has ever mentioned a thing about ancient giants or past discoveries. If a giant skeleton is discovered somewhere, it would most certainly be classified and hidden from the public. It wasn't like that in the 19th and early 20th century, though. Almost every year, there were at least a few newspaper headlines stating the discovery of ancient giant skeletons. It seemed to be quite normal to find bones of giants in America when the first settlers dug ancient mounds to prepare for roads, farms, and buildings. The New York Times, in particular, wrote many newspaper articles about the discoveries of giants. Let's read through some of them, starting with this one titled, "The Bones of a Giant Found," which was published on May 25, 1882, and reads, "A skull of heroic size and singular formation has been discovered among the relics of the mound builders in the Red River Valley. The mound was 60 feet in diameter and 12 feet high. Near the center were found the bones of about a dozen men and women, mixed with the bones of various animals. The skull in question was the only perfect one, and near it were found some abnormally large body bones. The man who bore it was evidently a giant. A thorough investigation of the mound and its contents will be made by the Historical Society." Another newspaper from May 5, 1885 reads this, "Last week, a small mound near Homer was opened by some schoolboys who found a skeleton. Today, a further search was made, and several feet below the surface of the earth in a large vault with a stone floor and bark covering were found 4 huge skeletons, 3 being each over 7 feet in length, and the other 8. This article from the San Antonio Express is telling about a giant skull that is twice the size of a normal human, and there is also a picture. The article reads, "Beach giant skull unearthed by WPA workers near Victoria, believed to be largest ever found in the world. Normal head also found." That Texas had a giant in the beach in the long ago appears probable from the large skull recently unearthed on a mound in Victoria County, believed to be the largest human skull ever found in the United States and probably in the world. Twice the size of the skull of a normal man, the fragments were dug up by W. Duffin, an archaeologist who is excavating the mound in Victoria County under a WPA project sponsored by the University of Texas. In the same mound and at the same level, a normal-sized skull was found. The pieces taken from the mound were reconstructed in the WPA laboratory under the supervision of physical anthropologists. A study is being made to determine whether the huge skull was that of a man belonging to a tribe of extraordinary large men, or whether the skull was that of an abnormal member of a tribe, a case of gigantism. Several large human bones have been unearthed at this site. Another article from the New York Times, written in 1897, reads, "One of the 3 recently discovered mounds in this town has been opened. In it was found the skeleton of a man of gigantic size. The bones measured from head to foot over 9 feet and were in a fair state of preservation. The skull was as large as a half-bushel measure. Some finely tempered rods of copper and other relics were lying near the bones. The mound from which these relics were taken is 10 feet high and 30 feet long, and varies from 6 to 8 feet in width. The 2 mounds of lesser size will be excavated soon." This article from the St. Paul Globe, written in 1904, states, "Bones of a human skeleton 11 feet high are dug up in Nevada. Workmen engaged in digging gravel here today uncovered at a depth of about 12 feet a lot of bones, part of the skeleton of a gigantic human being. Dr. Samuels examined them and pronounced them to be the bones of a man who must have been nearly 11 feet in height." Apparently, these discoveries were something completely normal back in the day, and they weren't hidden from the public as they are today. The discoveries of giant skeletons weren't limited just to North America. This article talks of a giant's skeletons found in a cave in Mexico. The article reads, "Charles C. Clapp, who was recently returned from Mexico, where he has been in charge of Thomas W. Lawson's mining interest, has called the attention of Professor Agassiz to a remarkable discovery made by him. He found in Mexico a cave containing some 200 skeletons of men, each above 8 feet in height. The cave was evidently the burial place of a race of giants who antedated the Aztecs. Mr. Clapp arranged the bones of one of these skeletons and found the total length to be 8 feet 11 inches. Other articles mention discoveries of giants in Europe. This article from 1892, written by the London Globe, tells of the discovery of a race of giants in modern-day France. It reads, "In the year 1890, some human bones of enormous size, double the ordinary in fact, were found in the tumulus of Castelnau and have since been carefully examined by Professor Kiener, who, while admitting that the bones are those of a very tall race, nevertheless finds them abnormal in dimensions and apparently of morbid growth. They undoubtedly reopen the question of the giants of antiquity, but do not furnish evidence to decide it." You have no idea how many more newspaper articles we found. There were discoveries of giants all across the globe, and today, scientists and archaeologists pretend this never even happened. This article, titled "When Giants Roamed Earth," talks about the historical discoveries of giants from the time of the Roman Empire to the 19th century. Here's what it reads. "The past was more prolific in the production of giants than the present. In 1830, one of these giants, who is exhibited at Rouen, was 10 feet high, and the giant Galabra, brought from Arabia to Rome in the time of Claudius Caesar, was the same height. Phantom, who lived in the time of Eugene II, was 11½ feet in height. The Chevalier Scrogg, in his journey to the Peak Tenerife, found in one of the caverns of that mountain the head of a giant who had 60 teeth and who was not less than 15 feet high. The giant Ferragus, slain by Orlando, the nephew of Charlemagne, according to reports, was 28 feet high. In 1814, near Saint Gernat, was found the tomb of the giant Isolent, who was not less than 30 feet high. In 1590, near Rouen, was found a skeleton whose head held a bushel of corn, and which was 19 feet in height. The giant Bacchart was 22 feet high. In 1623, near the castle in Dauphine, a tomb was found 30 feet long, 16 feet wide, and 8 feet high, on which were cut in gray stone the words, Cantholicus rex. The skeleton was found entire and measured 25 1/4 feet high, 10 feet across the shoulders, and 5 feet from breastbone to the back. But France is not the only country where giant skeletons have been unearthed. Near Palermo, Sicily, in 1516, was found the skeleton of a giant 30 feet high. Near Magrino, on the same island, in 1816, was found the skeleton of a giant of 30 feet, whose head was the size of a hogshead, and each tooth weighed 5 ounces. Although back in the days these discoveries were made public, once the discovered skeletons were brought to the respected museums and historical institutions, they completely disappeared and no one ever talked about them again. Here is a map of all reports of giants in North America. It's truly astonishing how many of them are there. Almost all of the discoveries end up in the Smithsonian Institute, and we all know how good they are at covering up major discoveries. There are also supposed reports of the Smithsonian purchasing giant skeletons excavated by citizens, which then disappeared, never to be heard from again. The Smithsonian even had a special division for exploring ancient mounds and supposed giant burial sites. One famous discovery of a giant, which was also covered up by the Smithsonian, is the San Diego giant from 1895, which was an 8-foot 4-inch tall mummified giant. There was even a picture of the giant mummy, which was shown in many newspapers. The mummy was inspected by many scientists. After his inspection, the San Diego giant was purchased by the Smithsonian. 13 years later, in 1908, when the mummy was being exhibited, the Smithsonian ran some tests and suddenly dismissed it as a hoax, saying it was made from gelatin. The fact that it took that long, and after spending so much money to acquire it, plus the fact that it was carefully inspected by experts 13 years earlier, does suggest there may be more to this story than meets the eye. Is it just a coincidence that absolutely every culture and religion tells stories of ancient giants who roamed the earth? The Sumerian civilization, which was said to have begun in approximately 6000 BC, tells of a race of giants which ruled over the Sumerians, and there are many depictions of them. Sumerian records speak of a giant king by the name of Gilgamesh, who ruled for 126 years. He is generally seen by scholars as an actual historical figure, since inscriptions have been found which confirm the existence of other figures associated with him. In ancient Egypt, there are hundreds of depictions of giants, and the Egyptian records describe the old pharaoh dynasties to be a race of tall giants, and hundreds of giant sarcophaguses were also found. But the mummies there had been long looted. This unusual story, with a headline, Prehistoric Egyptian Giants, was reported in multiple newspapers and reads, in 1881, when Professor Timmerman was engaged in exploring the ruins of an ancient temple of Isis on the banks of the Nile, 16 miles below Najar Jafard, he opened a row of tombs in which some prehistoric race of giants had been buried. The smallest skeleton out of some 60-odd, which were examined during the time Timmerman was excavating at Najar Jafard, measured 7 feet and 8 inches in length, and the largest 11 feet 1 inch. Memorial tablets were discovered in great numbers, but there was no record that even hinted that they were in the memory of men of extraordinary size. It is believed that the tombs date back to the year 1043 BC. According to the German newspaper Bild, an entrepreneur named Gregor Spory took a number of photos of a mummified giant finger in 1988. The owner of the finger was a retired grave robber who found the finger in an undisclosed tomb. The finger is nearly 14 inches long, and if it is genuine, it belonged to someone estimated to have been between 15 and 16 feet tall. The owner of the finger had a certificate to say that the finger was authentic, together with an X-ray image. Later, when Spory returned to Egypt to purchase the finger, the owner had disappeared, leaving us only with the photographs of this discovery. The book of Genesis, which is the first book of the Hebrew Bible and the Old Testament, tells us the story of an ancient giant race called the Nephilim. The story of the Nephilim Giants is further elaborated in another ancient manuscript, the Book of Enoch. Apparently, the Watchers, who were fallen angels, interbred with the women on earth, and as a result, the Nephilim Giants were born. We know that these ancient manuscripts describe the Great Deluge, a massive flood which, according to scientific data, really happened. If the biblical flood was real, could the Nephilim Giants also be real? The stories about giants don't end there. Every Native American tribe tells of the times when giants used to rule North America, and there were brutal wars between the giants and the Native Americans. The tribes had to unite together against a group of red-haired cannibalistic giants and fought them to extinction. The existence of giants could certainly explain some of the massive megalithic structures around the world, which by now had no explanation of how they were moved, like the Stone of the South at Baalbek, Lebanon, which weighs at a staggering 1,242 tons. On Mount Shoria in southern Siberia, researchers have found an absolutely massive wall of granite stones. Some of these gigantic granite stones are estimated to weigh more than 3,000 tons, more than double the weight of those in Lebanon. It's interesting to note that the original name for Stonehenge was the Giant's Dance, or the Giant's Ring. Stonehenge is a later Saxon name that translates to the Hanging Stones. Giants are also part of the Celtic mythology, the Greek and Roman mythology, the Hindus, Buddhists, Norse, and even in the Japanese Shinto folklore. In fact, there's an amazing video from an old military parade in Imperial Japan in which the Japanese proudly show this huge giant and parade him alongside the imperial soldiers. It's been said that this giant was the last member of a tribe of giants called Cha-Cha, who lived on an island with the name of Hahashima. There are many historical accounts of giants as well. Flavius Josephus, a 1st century Jewish scholar and historian, wrote this: "For which reason they removed their camp to Hebron, and when they had taken it, they slew all the inhabitants. There were till then left the race of giants, who had bodies so large and countenances so entirely different from other men, that they were surprising to the sight and terrible to the hearing. The bones of these men are still shown to this very day, unlike to any credible relations of other men." During the 1500s, when the Spanish navigators were exploring the coast of the Americas, sightings of live giants were also sighted. 3 captains of Spanish ships reported these taller-than-average native people on their expeditions to America, as well as Sir Francis Drake, Captain John Smith, and several other notable eyewitnesses. This is what Captain John Smith wrote about them. "The Sasquasahanogues are a giant-like people. They measured the calf of the largest man's leg and found it 3/4 of a yard about, and all the rest of his limbs were in proportion." In 1519, Spanish explorer Alonso Alvarez de Pineda was mapping the coastline of the Gulf Coast, marking the various rivers, bays, landmarks, and potential ports. Not far from where the river empties into the Gulf of Mexico, he found a large town and near it some 40 native villages. He described seeing many giants living in this village, and curiously, a race of tiny pygmies was also living there. Pineda described the tribes that settled near the Mississippi River as a race of giants from 10 to 11 palms in height, and a race of pygmies only 5 or 6 palms high. Perhaps the most intriguing and widely known tale of real giants in the age of exploration began with an account concerning none other than the great Portuguese explorer Ferdinand Magellan. Between the years of 1519 and 1522, Magellan embarked on his most famous voyage, a bold expedition to search for a good route to the Maluku Islands of the East Indies, that would eventually result in the first successful circumnavigation of the globe. Magellan was given command of 5 vessels, and one leg of their voyage took them out across the vast ocean, all the way to the faraway land of Patagonia, at the southern end of South America. It was there that the expedition would come across a rather baffling sight indeed. Here's an excerpt from the diary of Magellan's official chronicler. Leaving that place, we finally reached 49½ degrees toward the Antarctic Pole. As it was winter, the ships entered a safe port to winter. We passed 2 months in that place without seeing anyone. One day, we suddenly saw a naked man of giant stature on the shore of the port, dancing, singing, and throwing dust on his head. The Captain General, Magellan, sent one of our men to the giant so that he might perform the same actions as a sign of peace. Having done that, the man led the giant to an islet into the presence of the Captain General. When the giant was in the Captain General's and our presence, he marveled greatly and made signs with one finger raised upward, believing that we had come from the sky. He was so tall that we reached only to his waist, and he was well proportioned. It is significant to note that the above narrative is taken from the journal of the official chronicler of Magellan's voyage of discovery. That is the one person above all others who is tasked with recording and keeping the most accurate records of events and activities, whether exotic or mundane. This person is not only responsible to the commander of the voyage, but also to king and country for his eyewitness accounts as a complete, precise, and accurate testimony of events that occurred during the voyage. Based on his position and responsibilities alone, his first-hand eyewitness testimony of encounters with giants must be taken as factual information by an unimpeachable witness. To do otherwise is to trivialize the importance of the chronicler's fundamental accountability. Years later, in 1539, there was also the account of Hernando de Soto, another explorer, who came face to face with numerous giants during his adventures through the southeast portion of what is now the United States. De Soto had set out from Tampa Bay, Florida, with a contingent of hundreds of men, and during their trek, they allegedly frequently came across tribes of natives ruled by giants. One of these was a Chief Tuscaloosa, who was encountered in western Alabama and said to be a hulking giant of a man who towered over all others. There are also the reports from the Spanish conquistador and explorer Hernando de Alarcón, who is trying to find a river that could be used to move supplies to Spanish troops along the coasts of California and Mexico. Alarcón would eventually make his way up the Colorado River all the way up to the Grand Canyon, and during this journey, he and his men purportedly came across a tribe of around 200 giant warriors standing up to 10 feet tall. The giants were supposedly very aggressive, but Alarcón appeased them with gifts and other signs of peace. The conquistador Francisco Coronado also told of having come across whole tribes of giants during his quest throughout the Southwest in search of the legendary El Dorado. In some cases, there was physical evidence of these giants found, as was supposedly the case with the conquistador Bernal Diaz del Castillo, who served under Hernán Cortés during the Spanish conquest of Mexico. Within the pages of his detailed record of the conquest and subsequent collapse of the Aztec Empire, there is an odd account of a race of giants that were claimed by the Tlaxcatec Indians to have once inhabited the area. The chief of the tribe then provided the remains of these mysterious giants as evidence, of which Castillo would write, "They said their ancestors had told them that very tall men and women with huge bones had once dwelt among them. But because they were very bad people with wicked customs, they had fought against them and killed them, and those of them who remained had died off. And to show us how big these giants had been, they brought us the leg bone of one, which was very thick, and the height of an ordinary-sized man. And that was a leg bone from the hip to the knee. I measured myself against it, and it was as tall as I am, though I am of a reasonable height. They brought over pieces of bone of the same kind, but they were all rotten and eaten away by the soil. We were all astonished by the sight of these bones and felt certain there must have been giants in that land. There were so many reports of real giants being encountered throughout North and South America in the age of exploration, and such accounts have faded into history to be mostly forgotten. There are some things, however, that cannot be forgotten, as they are literally written in stone. That's the case of the giant footprint of South Africa. This is the most spectacular footprint in rock found anywhere on Earth to date. There are many others, however, like the giant footprint of Pingan, but none are as fully formed and obvious as the one in South Africa. Discovered in 1931 by a farmer called Stoffel Ketsi while hunting, it has remained one of the most controversial sites in archaeology and geological research. The footprint is about 4 feet, or 1.3 meters in length, which suggests that the creature who left it would have been 24 to 27 feet, or 7 to 8 meters in height. The footprint is known to locals as the footprint of God, or Goliath's footprint, and stories of ancient giants are told all throughout the region. Skeptics reject the giant footprint, claiming it was formed by natural erosion. However, Professor Peter Wagener from the University of Port Elizabeth in South Africa said that there is a higher probability of little green men arriving from space and licking it out with their tongues than being created by natural erosion. Judging by all the discoveries listed, together with all the historical accounts we mentioned, it may be possible that giants really existed. But could it be possible that somewhere in some remote place, a species of these enigmatic beings is still alive, hiding from humanity? We can't end this video without mentioning the most famous giant encounter, which didn't happen in ancient times, but in 2002. This occurrence, which is still classified by the U.S. government, was disclosed in the popular radio show Coast to Coast after witnesses of the event came through and anonymously told their stories. The events allegedly happened in 2002 in the deserts of Afghanistan, where a U.S. Army squad went missing. A special ops task force was sent to find out what happened, and the soldiers walked along a rugged mountainous trail until arriving at the entrance of a large cave. Around the clearing of the cave, there were pieces of broken U.S. military equipment and scattered gear, with traces of blood on them. The task force was about to enter the cave to search for the missing soldiers when a 13-foot-tall, red-headed, double-toothed humanoid emerged and attacked them. According to the witnesses, the giant pierced one of the soldiers with his long spear, killing him on the spot before the rest of the squad could take him down, shooting at his face for 30 seconds straight. Once the giant was dead, the task force went inside the cave and found remains of human bones, leading the military to think that the creature was cannibalistic. When this shocking incident was reported to the headquarters, the body of the giant was packed and loaded into a helicopter and transferred to a secret location in the USA for study. The giant weighed about 500 kilograms, estimated by the team who transported the body from the pickup location to the United States. The giant wore a canvas or animal hide to protect his feet, like some sort of moccasins. If there was a living giant hiding for so many years in the caves of Afghanistan without being discovered, we must assume that this giant must not be the only one living on this planet. Surely there must be others somewhere out there. This mysterious creature was caught on camera in the desert of Portugal a few years ago. Could it be another giant hiding from mankind? Thinking about all the classified discoveries out there, we should be lucky to know that billions of years ago, dinosaurs existed. If that was kept a secret, who would actually believe that creatures over 175 feet in height used to exist? And if we know for a fact that giant reptiles, giant birds, giant fish, and giant plants used to exist on Earth, is it so hard to believe that giant humanoids also existed and perhaps still do?
historians and archaeologists will look at that and scratch their head and go, we don't have any clue. How in the world did somebody quarry that rock? How did they carve that rock? How did they move that rock? Nobody can understand that when you're trying to look at it with that frame of mind. 6 foot tall guy. Looking at our resources today, we couldn't move something that. But if we let the scriptures speak for us, I believe this solves the problem. Amos 2:9. God describes the Amorites. Yet I destroyed the Amorite before them, whose height was like the height of the cedar trees. Like the height of the cedars. And he was strong as the oaks. Yet I destroyed his fruit from above and his roots from beneath. Cedar trees start at 35 feet and go up to 150 feet. The cedars of Lebanon, we're in Baalbek, Lebanon, where they're known for their cedar trees. Amos describes the giants, the Amorites. So I scaled Arnold Schwarzenegger up to a 35-foot person, 36-footer. And there's what you got. You imagine two guys like Arnold, strong as the oaks, right? Now that's pretty easy to see how that rock was moved. Hey Arnold, stop flexing. Get over here. Give me a hand. Stop showing off for the camera. I need some help here. That totally explains the megalithic structures all around the world. Let the scripture speak for itself. It tells you there were giants in the earth in those days. And also after that. That being before the flood, yes, and also after the flood. Josephus, historian, also describes giants. They were, till then, left the race of giants who had bodies so large and countenances so entirely different from other men that they were surprising to the sight and terrible to the hearing. These were horrific creatures. Josephus writes about these as a historian in the 1st century. And he actually says that the bones of these men are still on open display in his day. So apparently they had a little museum of the conquered giants that the Israelites wiped out. Here's the bones of the giants right here for everybody to see. All post-flood giants in the Bible are referred to as offspring of other giants found in the lineage of Canaan, Mizraim, Cush, and possibly Jacob. And I put in parentheses there Gog and Magog. I can't confirm this from Scripture. I don't have scriptural confirmation for this. However, historically speaking, there's a lot of evidence that Gog and Magog were giants. In fact, every year they have what's called the Lord Mayor Parade in the UK, where they march these two huge giants called Gog and Magog through the cities. Two big giants.
Well, Gog and Magog, one of the most familiar sights at any Lord Mayor show for many, many years. Traditional guardians of the City of London, they've been carried at the Lord Mayor show since 1554.
I stood on the Great Wall of China in 2006. Come to find out that the original name for the Great Wall of China was the Ramparts of Magog. And so when you stand on this massive wall, I mean this thing is huge and it goes on forever, that's not just to keep out Joe Blow's 6-footer out. It makes sense that they may have been trying to keep out a whole bunch of, 35-footers maybe, or whatever. But there's evidence that Gog and Magog may have indeed been giants.
Well, did you know the Great Wall of China wasn't always so great?
What should we do?
Okay, Nephilim 101, real quick. The men began to increase number on the earth, daughters were born to them. Sons of God, sons of daughters of men were beautiful. They married many of them, and chose. The Lord said, my spirit will not contend with man forever. He's mortal, his days will be 120 years. Nephilim on the earth in those days, and also afterward. And also afterward, when the sons of God went into the daughters of men and had children by them. And also afterwards means what? Thank you, we cleared that up real quick. And the angels who did not keep their position of authority but abandoned their proper dwelling, these he has kept in darkness, bound with everlasting chains for judgment on the great day. In a similar way, there's a linguistic tie here, Sodom and Gomorrah and the surrounding towns gave themselves up to sexual immorality and perversion. They serve as an example of those who suffer punishment of eternal fire. Another incursion with 10 spies, I've actually looked at all the translations. Basically it's this. Something is going on. Go down to the English Standard. And there we saw the Nephilim, the sons of Anak, who come from the Nephilim. And we seem to ourselves like grasshoppers. Excuse me. And so we seem to them. King James, last one. And there we saw the giants, the sons of Anak, which come of the giants. And we were on our own sight as grasshoppers, and so were we in their sight. Let's go back here. Go down to the last sentence. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days and also afterwards, when the sons of God went into the daughters of men and had children by them. What's happening here is the unthinkable. Fallen angels are procreating with the women of earth, and they're creating hybrid beings known as the Nephilim.
See these equations in Scripture, and using those, we can correctly identify that these were all hybrids. They were half man and half demon. Now, concerning the Amorites, God told the people, don't you worry. His angel would go before you, Moses says, before you and bring you into the Amorites. And I will cut them off. You shall not bow down to their gods, nor serve them, nor do according to their works. But you shall utterly overthrow them and completely break down their sacred pillars. Remember, God told the Israelites to destroy the 7 nations of Canaan. Man, woman, child, beast, everything. Is that a very nice God? Well, it all depends. Depends what kind of creatures he told them to destroy. If they're simply human, like you and I, it seems a bit capricious, doesn't it? It almost seems like the God that Richard Dawkins has in mind. But if we have some hybrids living in the land, now it begins to make sense. Because these people were not just mean and wicked, but they were genetically impure. They were a mix between demons and humans. And now it comes into focus. We find that the Amorites were still in the land in the time of the Judges. From the passage, do not fear the gods of the Amorites in whose land you dwell. So this is the time of the Judges. The Amalekites dwell in the land of the Negev. The Hittites, the Jebusites, and the Amorites dwell in the hill country. Then the men who had gone up with him said, we are not able to go up against the people, for they are stronger than we. Well, that was true. But the thing is, they were supposed to rely on God's angel, more than likely, referring to Jesus, to do the work for them and to have him supply their power. And they go on in Numbers 13. The land through which we have gone to spy it out is a land that devours its inhabitants, and all the people that we saw in it are of great height. And there we saw the Nephilim, the sons of Anak, who come from the Nephilim. And we seemed to ourselves like grasshoppers, and so we seemed to them. Now, God confirms that they are not exaggerating. God says, yet it was I who destroyed the Amorite before them, whose height was like the height of the cedars, and he was as strong as the oaks, yet I destroyed his fruit above and his roots beneath. So, I don't think God is one to exaggerate, personally. And God is saying that neither were the spies exaggerating. Their sin was not trusting in him. It wasn't because they were exaggerating. Nobody accused them of exaggerating. Come on, guys, they're not really that tall. I mean, so they're 7 feet, I'm sure we can take it. No, he wasn't saying that. He's saying they're like the heights of the cedars. Now, this is very significant because God uses this one other time in Scripture. In Job 40. He says, look now at the behemoth which I made along with you. He eats grass like an ox. See now his strength is in his hips, and his power is in his stomach muscles. He moves his tail like a cedar. I talk about this in the first 6 days, if you're interested. But this is a very good description of a sauropod dinosaur. And probably the sauropod dinosaur that we have in mind here is the Diplodocus, because that had a tail 46 feet long. That's a very good description of a cedar tree, I would say. So considering that cedar trees could grow anywhere from 40 to 80 feet tall, that's a pretty good description. So what God is doing is he's confirming that the Amorites, who were equal to the Nephilim, were of great stature. And they probably really were like grasshoppers. These guys weren't just saying that, oh, I felt so small compared to these guys. No, they really did. They were small compared to these guys. And so we should not underestimate what they're saying. Now, Moses talks about King Og of Bashan specifically. He says, only he remained of the remnant of the Rephaim. Behold, his bedstead was a bedstead of iron. Is it not in Rabbah of the children of Ammon? 9 cubits was the length thereof, and 4 cubits the breadth, and the cubit of a man. According to the Oxford Dictionary, the ancient measure of length derived from the forearm, varying at different times and places, but usually 18 to 22 inches. The Roman cubit was 17.4, the Egyptian 20.64. Now, Tim Lovett, who's an expert on ancient shipbuilding, he was investigating the Ark of Noah, and he did extensive research, and he found that the shortest cubit was the Greek short cubit, 14 inches, and among the longest were the Persian royal cubit of 25.2 inches, and the Arabic hashimi of 25.56 inches. Now obviously the Greek, Persian, and the Arabic cubits don't count because we're talking about the days of Moses, and these of course are much, much later. So the only one that fits is the Egyptian royal cubit. Stephen tells us that Moses was learned in all the wisdom of the Egyptians. So this would make sense. Moses had just come out of Egypt. He was a prince in the Pharaoh's house. He's going to use, the standard. If you go somewhere, you'll probably continue to use feet because that's what you know. And so Moses is going to use the Egyptian royal cubit. So that Egyptian royal cubit was 20.63 inches. And with that in mind, we can now put it into our own calculations, which would make his bed 15 feet 6 inches, and its width 6 feet 10 inches. So, and of course it was made of iron. It's not just some guy with a big ego, but because it was made of iron, it means that he was very heavy. And so he's probably a little bit shorter. He's probably about 15 feet tall. And when we begin to look at that, here's modern man, and there's Goliath, and we have the Irish giant of 12 feet, and then King Og, who's 15 feet. Putting them next to each other, you can see how you'd be somewhat intimidated next to this guy. And according to God, the Amorites were even taller. So, remember, King Og is just of the remnant of the Rephaim. He's not even the big guy. So, watch out. And how heavy was he? Well, thanks to Galileo, his equation he came up with, we can calculate his weight. So he was about 3,125 pounds. And he, probably could lift his own body weight, I'm sure, maybe double that. So he could probably lift at least 2 horses at the same time with a rider and 3 of them. Probably a mid-sized car today. You'd want to watch out if this guy's in your path. And he said it was a land that devours its inhabitants because everybody was of great stature. Well, we can also calculate his basal metabolic rate. That means just the amount of calories needed to keep his heart beating, to stay alive, just the basics. He needed at least 22,657 calories every day just to stay alive. That's not even talking about normal activity. You can only guess what he would have needed for normal activity. That's just his very basic is equal to 9 normal-sized persons. We convert that into pizzas. You've got 12 12-inch pizzas, or 63 cheeseburgers, and probably a lamb every 2 days. So if he was really working out and stuff and going to war, he may have needed a lamb every day, or maybe 2 lambs a day. It was a land that devoured its inhabitants. You can see why these guys needed to go. And you can see why the spies were somewhat tenuous to go and take the land. But again, trust in the Lord, not yourself. Josephus confirms that they were of great size, for which reason they removed their camp to Hebron. And when they had taken it, they slew all the inhabitants. There were till then left the race of giants who had bodies so large and countenances so entirely different from other men that they were surprising to the sight and terrible to the hearing. The bones of these men are still shown to this very day, unlike any credible relations to other men. So, just kind of looking at the data that we've seen so far, the Nephilim and all the other names that are in Scripture for them were the offspring of a demon father with a human mother. No evidence that the Nephilim came about as a result of the good boys hooking up with the bad girls, the daughters of Cain. That's just fantasy. Every anti-Nicene interpreter, Jewish and Christian, understood that the sons of God to be angels who had sexual relations with women, and the offspring of the relationship were the Nephilim. So if that was happening in that day, when Jesus says, as it was in the days of Noah. Okay, so keep that in mind. Now very quickly we're going to look at just some evidence of some modern giants. Now I know that there's all kinds of stuff floating around the internet, a lot of Photoshop stuff. So I was very careful to stay away from that kind of speculative evidence. And so I found this picture, which was taken from the Strand magazine, reprinted in C.F. Wood Martin's 1901 book. So it's not Photoshop. You can go and check it out yourself. There's no Photoshop involved here. And he says that the London and Northwestern Railway Company's Broad Street Goods Depot, and a photograph of which is reproduced here, this monstrous figure is reputed to have been dug up by Mr. Dyer whilst prospecting for iron ore in County Antrim in Ireland. The length 12 feet 2 inches, girth of chest 6 feet 6 inches, and length of arms 4 feet 6 inches. There are 6 toes on the right foot. Took half a dozen men and a powerful crane to place this article of lost property in position for Strand magazine artists. And we also have the New York Tribune, 1909. You can go online and you can look at newspaperarchive.org, and you can look at these microfiche copies of these newspapers for yourself. Ixtapalapa, a town 10 miles southeast of Mexico City, there had been discovered what was believed to be the skeleton of a prehistoric giant of extraordinary size. The skeleton of a human being that is estimated to have been about 15 feet high. Then from France, in a prehistoric cemetery recently uncovered in Montpellier, France, while workmen were excavating a waterworks reservoir, human skulls were found measuring 28, 31, and 32 inches in circumference. The bones that the workmen discovered were also of gigantic proportions. One of the scientists engaged in examining the skeletons says they belong to a race of men who stood between 10 and 15 feet in height. So we've seen that the sons of God were fallen angels, that they came. Jude and Peter confirm that, and the daughters of Adam and union with the sons of God created this human demonic hybrid. They were also known as Gegenes or Gigantes in the Greek, which means from the earth. These were the famous men of the ancient world. Chances are a lot of those Greek myths that we hear about have a kernel of truth in them, maybe bigger than we think. And all the ancient sources believe these to be the sons of humans and of demons. We saw King Og was about 15 feet, roughly 3,100 pounds. It was truly a land that devoured its inhabitants. So, the final attempt to corrupt the image of God. We've looked at what God did in the beginning, how He created us, how Adam fell, the genetics of the incarnation, how that happened sort of on the mechanics of what happened there. And now we see what is coming in our days. And first of all, we always start with Scripture, because that's where you have to start. In Daniel 2:43 it says, "And you saw iron, as you saw iron mixed with ceramic clay, they will mingle with the seed of men, but they will not adhere to one another, just as iron does not mix with clay. And in the days of these kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom which shall never be destroyed." So there's some important things to notice here. They will mingle. This is in Aramaic in this case, mitarvin, which means it's a reflexive verb. It's a reflexive verb. It means that they're going to do something to themselves. Kind of like when you bathe yourself or you cut yourself. You are both the subject, you're the one doing it, and you're also the recipient, you're the object of the verb. So whoever these guys are, they are going to mingle themselves with the seed of men. So that already gives us a clue that we're looking at two dissimilar natures.
The latter days, in part, will be distinguishable because of the rise of powers that have been suppressed or repressed over the years, but in the latter days those powers will emerge once again. And one of our favorite verses has to do with some of the words of Jesus in Matthew 24, starting in verse 36, "But of that day and hour knoweth no man, no, not the angels of heaven, but my Father only. But as the days of Noah were, so shall also the coming of the Son of Man be." And what he's saying here is the days of Noah will be sort of transplanted into the latter day era. And you and I both believe we're seeing that right now.
Absolutely. One of the, in my opinion, we're looking at the return of the Nephilim. It's a different incursion than what happened thousands and thousands of years ago. I call it the coming great deception. And what we're going to see is, or what we are seeing, is this manifestation of orbs and craft and other phenomena, other anomalies. Meanwhile, shows like the History Channel's Ancient Aliens program is promulgating what I call the coming great deception. They're saying that E.T. created all life on this planet, that they genetically manipulated all life on this planet, that they started the world civilizations and religions, and now are coming back at this critical juncture in human history.
It is curious where the trail can begin to lead when looking at ancient bloodlines. When talking about the word Nephilim, what we're dealing with is a little bit deeper and darker and larger in scope than giantism, a really tall guy, or your favorite basketball player. The term Nephilim became synonymous with giants because that's what they tended to be. It is by no means limited to that meaning. In fact, the word Nephilim is more of an umbrella term for the hybrid children, creatures of any high strangeness, which are actual flesh and blood, biological products of the B'nai Ha-Elohim, the fallen angels.
Been stripped of their apparel. They go naked, and they have horrible faces.
This is a quote from an early Jewish writing called the Book of the Cave of Treasures. It tells of fallen angels and their bastard children called the Nephilim. God destroyed the Nephilim's bodies and doomed them to wander the earth in an invisible dimension, and they are still terrifying men. In our modern paradigm, they are known as demon spirits. The word demon is from the Greek language and implies a supernatural knowledge. This demon knowledge is superior to our own knowledge. The Bible tells of their creation in Genesis chapter 6, and they were the cause of the destruction of life on earth. The Apocrypha and early Jewish writings expound on these evil spirits. The Book of Enoch tells of their giant stature and how they manipulated the genetics of man and animals in every imaginable way. In other words, no stone was left unturned in their evil experiments.
Against the animals, what does that mean? Sin against the animals is a reference to genetic manipulation, which created the animal-human hybrids of mythology, which appears to have also made a way for the disembodied spirits. Remember we talked about that the demons, where they came from? They're disembodied spirits from Nephilim, to have host bodies to once again inhabit, thus bringing about their return. Dr. Judd Burton has become a good friend of mine in recent months. I just met him. I've had him on my radio show a few times, and we talk by phone quite a bit. He's written an extraordinary little book here called Interview with the Giant. I highly recommend you check it out. You can get it on lulu.com. Interview with the Giant. This is a quote from his book. He said, "Despite the loss of their physical bodies from dying in the flood, there is reason to believe that the giants, spirits, continue to exist. In this state, they were and are demonic entities. Like other sentient creatures, they have an eternal spirit at their essence. Therefore, the Nephilim and related tribes of giants never really ceased to exist. Only their physicality was lost." So if they're out there wandering around as disembodied spirits, they want a body back. Well, what if the creation of something God never intended to exist provides that opportunity? Because God created, Paul talks about that there's a spirit for man, there's a spirit for animals, there's a flesh for angels, a flesh for man, right? Paul talks about that. Well, God never created a provision for this. He never wanted it to exist. So what kind of spirit would enter that? I think it's a reasonable assumption to say the only spirit fit to enter that are the disembodied spirits that were corrupt to begin with. I believe that's plan B. If no other angel is going to risk the severity of the judgment, and they still wanted to mess with man, how are they going to do it? Plan B, mix animals with humans.
Locked! Azazel taught men to make swords and knives and shields and breastplates, and made known to them the metals of the earth and the art of working them, and bracelets and ornaments, and the use of antimony, and the beautifying of the eyelids, and all kinds of costly stones, and all coloring tinctures. And there arose much godlessness, and they committed fornication, and they were led astray became corrupt in all their ways.